What's up guys? It's one of those morning videos. I've always wondered, do you guys prefer when I record first thing in the morning with a deeper voice, or later when I sound a little bit more enthusiastic? Anyway, I have begun my testing of the list of battleships that I said I would take a better look at. I'm doing all of my testing in chapter 14.4 because I believe that is the pinnacle of where these kinds of mobbing battleships are relied upon the most. I made another channel where I'm going to upload all of my raw footage so it'll be easier to access rather than checking for unlisted links in the description of my videos. Since they're just going to be the raw recordings, there are going to be times during runs where I randomly go AFK and then come back after 5 minutes and things like that, which I won't edit out. In any case, if you want to see my process, you can go give that a check. I might upload raws there before the finished videos come out here, so it'll also be kind of a teaser to what I'm working on at the time. However, try not to draw any conclusions from the raw footage, or at least don't attribute it to me if you do. Compared to all the other chapters, Chapter 14 has the most amount of suicide ships, not very many planes, and the concealment mechanic, which makes having sources of AoE damage even more important than it is in other chapters. It also has quite a large anti-submarine component, even more so than Chapter 15. Since I haven't done Chapter 14 in a while, I had the impression that Chapter 15 was just Chapter 14 but with planes, but it's not really true, as Chapter 15 is a lot more chill with the suicide ships and submarines. Concealment is also not as prevalent in Chapter 15, but still there in some parts. Now I will briefly explain the fleet setup that I'm using. The Vanguard was picked based on consistency alone. They don't have much trouble surviving the battles with the help of Unicorn, and don't have RNG skills that could change the outcome of the battle. Unicorn is an obvious choice with no RNG, and makes Vanguard survival not something I have to worry about at all. This is my second Unicorn, retrofitted at level 120 with no Oath, so that she doesn't deal too much damage, but can survive and has sufficient healing. Theseus is just a typical strong carrier without too much RNG, who can desync from the other main fleet strike timings. This is how fleets should be built to minimize damage downtimes that could lead to dangerous enemies staying alive for long periods of time. Obviously, Theseus is not the only viable option. Ships like Saratoga, Soryu Meta, Essex, and so on will do pretty much the same thing. Onto the battleships, I will be using all +13 equipment for the relevant equipment, as well as the Plymouth gun secondary, as I'm trying to make them carry as much of the load as possible so that any differences in performance will be easily noticeable. With this gun and the high performance fire control radar, the battleships will always strike before the carriers to ensure that their damage will not be affected by the subsequent airstrikes. The most important factors that I will be evaluating are whether or not they deal enough damage to actually wipe out the enemies when they strike, consistency, and interception ability to protect your carriers. If a ship has poor interception but they have some kind of skill that protects the main fleet to compensate, then it will be considered for the same metric. I believe that these are the most important things that a mobbing battleship needs to excel at. And obviously, if I need to use a special equipment like Nelson's Pennant to fulfill a skill requirement, then I will. Another reason I'm choosing Chapter 14 is because the enemies have enough HP and the stage is threatening enough such that the weaker battleships will clearly struggle with the setup I'm using. The lower chapters will get rolled by any battleship unless I use a fleet that is gimped to an unrealistic extent. On the other hand, Chapter 15 puts too much of an emphasis on anti-air, and a solo damage carry is not nearly enough, so it'll be hard to identify the exact differences between battleships. Chapter 14 does have a high anti-submarine requirement, and if the fleet fails due to submarines hitting the main fleet out of ammo, I will not hold it against the battleship. I will be engaging only the fleets that are outside of the foggy areas because I want to minimize RNG as much as possible. One last thing, I left my fleet tech on, but I'm not using any cats in the mob fleet. The boss fleet is the same main fleet that I recommended a long time ago, and I'm sticking with it. There are a few cross-fleet effects, but none of them bias the result toward one battleship or another. UVH's cross-fleet barrage may slightly reduce the burden of interception for the battleship, but you should really be using her in your boss fleets for this stage. I think this is all I have to say for why I chose this chapter. I probably had some other thoughts that I forgot about, but if you have any questions or concerns about that, then feel free to let me know in the comments. Okay, getting into the actual results. For this video, I have 3 battleships that I want to go over. Nelson, Nagato Meta, and Rodney Meta. First up is Nelson Retrofit, who is going to set a baseline for what is acceptable. In terms of shelling, Nelson is actually on the higher end of gold battleships thanks to her incredibly high stats and decent self-buffs. Unfortunately, shelling is at its least important in this stage thanks to the concealment mechanic. In the 4th fight here, she actually couldn't take damage 3 times even with her Pennant Auxiliary, so she ended up not proccing her barrage. Therefore, it's technically not a guaranteed barrage, but in Chapter 14 there are plenty of opportunities for her to take damage even after the effect of the Pennant runs out, so it should proc on all the following salvos. As expected, her barrage really struggles against shielded enemies and heavy armor enemies, and in this chapter there are occasionally shielded heavy armor enemies that she can barely put a dent in, as you can see with this Yamashiro right here. However, it is really good at taking out straggling low HP ships and suicide bomb boats that a more focused barrage like New Jersey's or Tamaki's would not be able to reach. By the end of the fights with ammo, Theseus was pretty low on HP. Looking at the end screen results, just as some supplementary information, Nelson had less than Theseus most of the time. The fleet also manages to get by one fight without ammo, at the cost of Theseus. Keep in mind that while this fleet struggled to spawn the boss, it's not an indication that Nelson is not good enough for the chapter. I'm purposely gimping the fleet so that it doesn't roll over the enemies too hard, because I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the different battleships. You can clear Chapter 14 on Lethal with Nelson as your mob flagship, and I will link the video where I do so in the description. Next, let's see how Nagato Meta did. To be honest, I don't expect her to be a huge upgrade over Nelson Retrofit. Her barrage is a slight upgrade, but it shares many of the same weaknesses, and her shelling is slightly worse than Nelson's. I chose to use no IJN ships in the fleet, not necessarily because she would be stronger this way, but just for consistency's sake. Let's take a look at this sequence in the first battle. There is a battleship production at the edge of the screen that is firing at Theseus, but the repair ship and the elite in the middle are going to draw aggro from Nagato. But is this really Nagato's fault? It takes quite an exceptional battleship to be able to kill both the high priority enemies and also the dangerous enemy in the corner. I don't think that most gold battleships are capable of doing so, to be honest. This is why I'm resorting more so to observational analysis rather than looking at their damage and clear times. By the time this fleet runs out of ammo, the fleet as a whole is still looking pretty healthy. This combined with the fact that Nagato's damage looks much closer to Theseus in the end screen points in the direction that Nagato Meta is an upgrade over Nelson Retrofit. I engage a 3-star escort node with the fleet and barely get out alive. Most of the damage is done by the suicide ships that are too tanky to kill when out of ammo. Now, let's move on to the final ship for this round, Rodney Meta. I was pretty harsh toward her initially because I didn't realize exactly how strong her big nuke barrage was. In total, she has the equivalent of Big 7 every 24 seconds, a huge nuke with an 80% chance to proc on fire, and her summons help against suicide ships as well. Due to no fault of her own, the fleet ended up running into the same situation as before with Nagato on the 3rd battle. The repair ship and elite in the middle of the stage once again took all of the aggro from Rodney, including her huge nuke barrage, allowing the battleship production to stay alive for far too long, and taking a huge chunk of HP from Theseus. Honestly, a big part of the problem is Theseus herself being a little too squishy. Maybe I should have chosen another carrier, but it's too late now. In the very next battle, the same thing happens again, and Theseus goes down. The fault lies in part with the Vanguard for being too weak, and Theseus for being too squishy, not something that can be blamed on Rodney herself. And here is where Rodney actually ended up taking over. Despite losing an entire ship, The fleet clears a 3-star battleship node without much issue, with Rodney carrying most of the load. Because of how impressively Rodney Meta ended up performing, I ended up not discarding the run, even though losing Theseus wasn't really her problem. I don't think most of the other battleships would be able to go through 3 extra nodes with an entire ship missing from the fleet, just because they don't output as much damage as frequently as Rodney does. You can see from the end screens just how much damage she pulls every battle. Although her big nuke barrage has a 20% chance to not proc, she gets enough damage from other sources that it ends up not really mattering on average. Someone wrote a comment that their Rodney Meta was performing at the level of FDG, and honestly, I can see it now. I'm fairly confident at this point that she is probably stronger than Izumo for campaign. Among the 3 ships, I will put Nelson at acceptable, Nagato Meta in great, and Rodney Meta in amazing. I might move them around as I keep testing more ships though. At the end, I might uncap the ships in the highest category and compare them to my other level 125 battleships like Hood and Izumo, and if any of them are strong enough, then maybe even to the URs. As a bonus, here are the end screens of the boss battles. Watarase is still level 120 with no oath, and she's trading blows with my maxed Hindenburg. Just a little taste of how strong Watarase actually is. Anyway, that's it for this video. Maybe you can request which 3 battleships I should look at next, and I'll choose from the 3 highest liked comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.